Hey y'all, I'm back with another legacy video, and today I'm going to be talking about Dimir Tempo. This video will serve as a thorough deck tech and some advice for beginners to help you get started with this deck. And I wanted to start off simply by talking about why you might want to play Dimir Tempo. Well, to start off, this deck is certainly one of the best decks in Legacy. It can beat basically anything. And while there are certainly bad matchups, quite a lot of matches feel good, really strong, or at the very least, every matchup feels winnable if you draw well enough and if you play well enough because of how flexible quite a lot of the interaction is. It's a really fun deck to play too, and it rewards Magic fundamentals. And so before I get too much into beginner advice, I would say that my biggest advice to anyone who wants to pick up the deck is to really feel like you either have strong fundamentals of the game of Magic or are willing to learn those along the way. Because if you're doing subtle sequencing errors, if you are not assessing how to play certain matchups, when you need to push and try to win, or when you need to fall back and be defensive, you will certainly lose a lot of games that actually were quite winnable with this deck. And that comes with a lot of practice, a lot of experience, a lot of thinking through how things need to work, and ultimately having a bit of an intuition about the game that I think is not unteachable, but is tough to learn. But the more you play, the more that intuition starts to really take shape. I want to start here by talking about basically every card in the deck and its role. And I want to start off with something that we all take for granted, which is the mana base. Dimir Tempo is a nice tempo deck with regard to its mana, in that it can be very secure with both basic island and basic swamp. And if you find yourself in a hand where you might be able to make those land drops or fetch for both basics, then you're in pretty good shape with your mana. However, sometimes it would serve you to play around Wasteland simply by just fetching a Underground Sea and then just planning on always getting Underground Seas. The reason why Underground Sea is so powerful is it means that you could Thoughtseize or start with a Nethergoyf turn 1 while still holding up Daze, and then the next turn you could Brainstorm and still potentially fetch. Whereas if you started with the basic Swamp, now when you play Thoughtseize, you can't really Brainstorm the next turn and have it be a reliably good Brainstorm with a shuffle effect. So there are certainly consequences to opting for mana stability. And deciding how you want to play that is crucial to starting games successfully. And if you want to play tempo and gain the biggest jump in win percentage possible right off the gate, you need to master your openings. And later I'm going to show some opening hands and how I would play those. The fetch lands are pretty self-explanatory. Those fix your mana. And along with the fetch lands, you can get an Undercity Sewers to surveil. And surveilling is really important, not only for selection in this deck, but this card can also grow your Nethergoyfs. Sometimes, if you don't really have anything to do with your mana for a turn cycle, you can even crack a fetch land in your main phase to get an Undercity Sewers to grow Nethergoyf to push a point of damage. That could also be the extra card you need in the graveyard to have a successful 2-card flow state to power out Murktide Regent a little bit sooner. So Undercity Sewers is quite valuable for all of those reasons. Then there is Wasteland. Wasteland is sort of a land and sort of a spell. And you have to decide how you want to use that. And 90% of the time, you're going to use it to destroy an important land on your opponent's side of the table. But there are a few reasons why you might not want to do that. The first reason is that you need the mana. And while Wasteland doesn't really cast any spells, it might help you to cast a flow state or a Bilbo. It might help you to crack a clue from Tameo or power out Kaito on turn 3. And a lot of times choosing to Wasteland when you have something that could have paid for could actually slow you down quite a lot. And a lot of times it's better to Wasteland once you already have action on board. So rather than Wastelanding and then failing to get Kaito in play, a lot of times it's better to get your Kaito into play, let your opponent tap that land one more time, and then Wasteland it. And then they are going to struggle to get caught back up as your engines are online. So Wasteland is a tremendously powerful card if used correctly, but there's so many decisions packed into this card. I'll give you a few more nuanced uses for this. You can Wasteland your own land to potentially get yourself card types in the yard to be able to get Murktide. So like sheer cards in the yard that you might need for that delve. You might Wasteland your own land because your opponent has Carpet of Flowers and you want to shut them off mana on one of the final turns of the game. Additionally, you might want to use Wasteland in certain phases of the game. So let's say you want to resolve an important spell on your main phase, backed by Daze, but your opponent is currently playing around Daze with one untapped non-basic land. Well, let's say you went to combat, you attack with your Nethergoyf, now it's the end of combat. Rather than going to the main phase, you end of combat Wasteland your opponent, and now that important Murktide or important Flow State or whatever it is, you can Daze your opponent. So understanding the true timing spectrum that you have access to is important. When I play on Magic Online, I have a stop in every single phase: upkeep, draw step, main phase, beginning combat, attacks, blocks, end of combat, or rather damage, end of combat, second main, end step. Every single one of those has a stop. And sometimes that Wasteland might just come in at the end of combat, maybe the beginning of combat. Maybe you do it in your draw step so that on your first main phase, you can resolve that important spell around Daze. But keeping in mind how flexible the timing of this card can be is super crucial. And there's always the classic gotcha trick of your opponent is playing around Daze, but they have a fetch land up, and then you Wasteland the fetch land. In response, you Daze their spell. So that is sort of a tempo use of Wasteland. It's almost like turning Wasteland and Daze into a force of will, because they will end up getting the land, but your spell will resolve. But that play sometimes is the difference between winning and losing. Now let's talk about the 1-drops. So starting with Thoughtseize, what a powerful Magic card Thoughtseize is. If you have not really spent much time playing with Thoughtseize, this card is a heck of a drug. And it's so good for so many reasons. You pretty much get to take your opponent's best card. And my recommendation is you always look at the card that is most likely to win your opponent the game. So rather than picking like a Brainstorm or something, or like Force of Will, something that is really helping them, like if it's Show and Tell that you're playing against and they have a Show and Tell in hand, just take that card. That's going to pay off 90% of the time. But understanding when the other 10% happens is what separates really great players from good players. In addition to Thoughtseize, clipping those cards, the information that you get is so valuable. What if you're in the mirror and you Thoughtseize your opponent and you see that they have Snuff Out, and you have a Murktide region in hand, and a Nethergoyf in hand. Well, you probably never want to play this Murktide region out, and you probably want to make that a dead card by simply powering out your black creatures. Or maybe you just make sure that Tamiyo hits the board before the Murktide. So having that information to sculpt your entire game plan around is so valuable. Thoughtseize is really amazing. You can also pump your Nethergoyf. You can, let's say Nethergoyf is a 2/3. You have creature and instant in the yard. You Thoughtseize yourself and put a Kaito in the yard, and now it's a 4/5. That particular situation is quite hypothetical. It's much more likely that, say, a land and something else would be in the graveyard. You'd be pretty crazy to Thoughtseize your own Kaito, but if that meant you could attack for lethal, then actually that would be the play. So don't forget that very occasionally, even in this deck, Thoughtseizing yourself is a worthwhile play. Nethergoyf is probably the secondary threat of the deck after Tamiyo, but Nethergoyf will get your opponents dead quickly. My particular list that I run doesn't have Mishra's Baubles. I've never been a huge fan of that card, but that card can really help to power out even stronger Nethergoyfs. But don't forget that this card also has the built-in card advantage of the escape. And that means sometimes you can bin one for free with Undercity Sewers and you still have access to that card. Sometimes, if you flip your Tamiyo, your Nethergoyf can pivot and become a blocker. And a deck like Boros Energy will have a real hard time ever attacking through a Nethergoyf. Quarry Steelcutter tokens will also have a hard time attacking through a Nethergoyf. So don't forget that sometimes Nethergoyf is your best defender as well. And that the clock of a Tamiyo Planeswalker ultimate is actually a faster clock than attacking through a bunch of random jump blockers with your Nethergoyf. Let's talk about Tamiyo. Tamiyo is the reason to play this deck. It is probably the best card in the deck. It is the thing that holds everything together, and starting with a turn 1 Tamiyo is one of the scariest starts in Magic the Gathering. Most of the time, if you have a Tamiyo and a Thoughtseize, I would recommend starting with the Thoughtseize. But if you start off with Tamiyo, you have your opponent on the back foot immediately. If you have a Tamiyo, a Daze, and a Wasteland in hand, I mean, you just feel like you have completely won the game just looking at your opening hand. The card advantage, this card is just insane. Of course you know that. But what separates the great Tamiyo gamers from just okay Tamiyo gamers is knowing a few things. Number one, when do you want to just leave Tamiyo a creature and crack clues forever? A lot of times that's if the game is just kind of stalled out. And your opponent could have removal, and they're not doing anything, and they're not stopping your Tamiyo. They might have removal, but they're afraid of a brainstorm or something like that. Just keep making clues and cracking the clues, and do that forever. The other reason why some people might not be as good with Tamiyo as possible is not knowing when to -3 the Tamiyo. That ultimate is so appealing, and it's game winning. I mean, I can count 2 or 3 games I've lost after ultimating a Tamiyo, maybe a little bit more, but I play a ton of Magic, so I'll just say it's quite rare. But that doesn't mean that that's the correct line. A lot of times, -3ing and picking up a Thoughtseize, picking up a Force of Will is just better. And against combo, that's often correct. In a fair deck, you just have to ask, what if my opponent's on a 2-turn clock and I'm still 3 turns away from ultimating? Well, then actually just getting that Force of Will back to protect my earlier win might just be better. So understand when to get greedy and go for the ultimate. Understand when to -3 and get value, because the difference there can often be game winning. It stinks when your Tamiyo is on 8 loyalty and it just gets prismatic ending or petty thefted. So definitely Tameo is a value card first and a win condition second. Fatal Push is a really great removal spell in Legacy right now. It has its shortcomings for sure. You'll never Fatal Push a Murktide. You can try, you can cast it, but it will not resolve. But Push can handily deal with many of your opponent's creatures. And really then the question is what to push, and you just have to assess what the most dangerous creature is that your opponent has and let go other things. But a lot of times legacy decks don't have such an abundance of creatures. If there's a real problematic creature, just push it. It's too hard to start naming names of creatures. There's so many that could warrant a push, but just don't forget that you might need a fetch land to turn on Revolt. You might need to have a creative way to turn on Revolt. You could crack a clue. Flipping Tameo turns on Revolt. So just be thinking about all that stuff. Flashing in Kaito or ninjutsuing Kaito turns on Revolt. Pinging your own creature with a Bowmaster can turn on Revolt. Dazing and with returning an island turns on Revolt. Do not Fatal Push a creature where you need Revolt and forget that. Ponder and Brainstorm, I'm going to just loop these together. If you've played any Legacy, you're very familiar with these cards. Make sure when you're casting Brainstorm that you have a shuffle effect handy. If you have both of these cards in hand and you don't have a shuffle effect handy, unless you're really desperate, you're going to want to cast a Ponder instead of a Brainstorm. Sometimes, though, you might want to Brainstorm end step if you're planning on spending all your mana on the next turn already, but you still feel like you need something like a Force of Will in hand. It's worth it to Brainstorm on the end step. Maybe that will help you power out a Murktide a little bit faster. So you have to also think about when to get the maximum value off of Brainstorm and when to get another spell into the graveyard and just keep churning through your deck. So your ability to assess that will be important to your success. Moving on to the 2-drops, let's talk about Daze. Wow, what another card that you can really get used to playing. This deck could run as many as maybe 3 Dazes. I mean, if there's a lot of combo going on, I've played 4 Daze in this deck, and it can be good. But, well, again, if you've played a lot of Legacy, you know Daze. I think the key to this deck is to understand when Daze is live and when it's not. And there's actually a lot more times when Daze is live, because you can see that even if your opponent can pay for that Daze, it's going to stop them from doing another key thing. So finding those nuanced situations where you can get more value out of Daze will help you. Maybe it just turns on that Revolt. Maybe you're just picking up a Sewers and then you can Surveil. But think about places where you can get extra mileage out of Daze. It's pretty rare that you want to hard cast it, but sometimes. I don't really have great examples in mind of when that would be, but maybe you want to double Daze, but you have Island and Swamp in play. Well, then you have to cast a Daze, paying mana, at least one of them. So just be thinking about that. Orcish Bowmasters is another reason to be on this deck. Currently, I'm on 2, as you'll see, but you could certainly do 3, sometimes even 4 if it's really well positioned, if blue is very dominant in the meta. I really like to cast Orcish Bowmasters in situations where my opponent cannot Brainstorm in response. And so sometimes that means when they're tapped out rather than continuing to hold it up forever. But tapping out comes at an opportunity cost, so you just have to gauge that for yourself. But Bowmasters is certainly the best card in the deck to help power out Kaito. And I'll say one thing about the interaction of these cards. If you are playing against a blue deck, you want to ninjutsu the token back, even though it's gone forever. But if you're playing against a deck like Energy, or almost any, I would say, non-blue decks that don't draw a lot of cards, you actually want to get the Bowmaster back, because the ETB ping will be very valuable, or it's a card back in your hand that could be brainstormed away. So knowing when to return the Bowmaster versus the token will really help you to be a better Kaito gamer. All right, the new card, Bilbo. This is a new exciting card in the deck. People are already talking about this potentially being banned. I don't necessarily see that yet. It's just much too premature to say such a thing. But this card in this deck, I feel, is just a powerful synergistic card that you can throw in. It's really good with Thoughtseize. It's exceptional with Flow State because it only costs 1 mana out of the graveyard. But I don't think it's a card that this particular deck wants to build around. I just don't think you have the cuts in an already really tight and well positioned, well delivering shell. But I'm curious to see how this will continue. Just remember, sometimes you can grow a Murktide with a Bilbo. Sometimes you can shrink a Nethergoyf with a Bilbo. Think about all that stuff when you're resolving this attack trigger, because there are many such factors to the deck that can be a little bit at odds with each other. Flow State is another really powerful card. This is another card people have talked about potentially being banned. I think it's probably not the closest on the chopping block, but I wouldn't be shocked if one day it did get banned. It's very powerful. Sometimes it's better to just cast it, even if you're just getting 1 card. But if you can hold it and get the 2 cards, that is really nice. I will say sometimes you can cast a Flow State for 2, or rather get 2 cards off of it, or you could Murktide, but if you Murktide, now you're not going to be able to get 2 cards. Pro tip, get the Murktide. You want to get that game over with quickly if you're playing this deck, and Murktide is the finisher to help, and I'll talk more about it later. But you have to have a really good reason to choose to Flow State instead of Murktide, in my opinion. Like, you really need a force of will, or you're really behind on cards. You think they could answer Murktide. Otherwise, the reason why I'm not on 4 copies of this is it is more situational than you would think. It's very powerful objectively, but you want to be pushing to the finish line with this deck, and Flow State doesn't really help with that. All right, moving on to the 3 drops. Brazen Borrower is the Swiss Army knife of the deck. You can bounce so many things. I think the number 1 best card to bounce with this is a Merit Lage, but there are so many things. Murktide Regent is another great card if your opponent has it to bounce it. Sometimes, though, you just need to get the game over with, and you don't need to Petty Theft. You just need to get that Borrower in. Keep in mind as well, if this card's already in play, if you ninjutsu it back, now you have Petty Theft again. And with Bilbo, you should also be able to cast Brazen Borrower for 1 less mana if it's on an adventure. This card can do so many things, and sometimes that body can be the final piece to a win. Just a really nice flexible card. So many things you can do. Kaito. Kaito could be my favorite card of the deck, honestly. It's amazing. I just called Borrower a Swiss Army knife, but Kaito is like a Swiss Army machine gun. It does so much and is so strong and is often uncounterable, unremovable. Once you start getting 2 cards a turn and the selection of the Surveil 2, I mean, it's like every single turn you're flow stating. Tapping a creature down is basically a removal spell as well. And if you just need to get the game over with, you can always plus. Along the way, if you need to tap a creature down multiple times, you will have to plus if you don't want to just lose your Kaito, and almost certainly you do not want to just lose your Kaito. And sometimes you just have to cast it, and there's nothing wrong with that. Typically, if I'm casting a Kaito, I do still want a 0. You have to keep in mind that if your opponent has not lost life, you won't gain the card. But it's still worth it to have selection over your next draw. In addition, if you cast Kaito and your opponent Force of Wills, they've lost life. Don't forget that. And you can draw that card if you 0 the Kaito. So remember situations in which your opponent loses life, even if you have not gone to combat. Moving on, I'm going to skip over Force of Will for now. I'm going to save that one for last. And now I want to talk about Murktide. Murktide Regent is the ultimate finisher. It's a 2-mana 8/8 a lot of the times, but sometimes you need to keep card types in the yard for Nethergoyf or Flow State. So manage your graveyard with care when delving for a Murktide. But a lot of people like Barrowgoyf in the deck. I think no card gets the game over quite like Murktide Regent. And another reason is that there's so many pieces of interaction your opponent could have, especially main deck, that this dodges. Like in the mirror, it dodges Fatal Push. It does not dodge Snuff Out, but it dodges Fatal Push. It dodges Bolt. There's so many things that really cannot remove a Murktide. And with it being potentially an 8/8 immediately, it's just so powerful at ending the game. And if you play without it, you'll start to notice that your closing power is not as strong. And this deck needs closing power. You have to get over the finish line as quickly as possible. Not as fast as a deck like Dimir Tempo, but it is a tempo deck. You do want to be pushing towards the finish line always. All right, Force of Will. Need I say more? Force of Will is the glue that holds Legacy together. If Force of Will wasn't in the format, there would be such degenerate gameplay. Just keep in mind you always need a blue card in hand, but if you have 5 mana, you can hard cast it. If you pay 5 mana to hard cast it, just hope your opponent isn't holding a Daze. It's just such a strong and necessary card, and it's why people play blue. So if you are used to playing the game with Force of Will, going back to playing without it feels a little rough. So I just love this card. Definitely a card I don't like leaving home without these days. I want to talk about the sideboard now and just a little bit more generally. So I have some groupings here for different archetypes, different macro archetypes. So this left column is largely what I would call the non-fair deck column. So when you are playing against a combo deck, you have access to all of these cards, maybe even Hydroblast. Maybe even if they have Hexing Squelcher, you might want to snuff out over a Fatal Push. But these are cards that can all come in. Some of these also have fair applications, like Consign to Memory can also handle Eldrazi, can also handle Death and Taxes. So that's a very flexible card. Surgical Extraction can sometimes come in blue mirrors if it's a deck that relies a lot on the graveyard. This second column is for fair decks that are not the mirror. Massacre, I think, is really important right now to handle energy and Death and Taxes. It's a heck of a card if your opponent has a Plains and you have a Swamp. Yes, there are things that dodge this. Like in energy, they have Voice of Victory, which is a 1/3. Just be careful. Hydroblast, also really important for your Quarry Steel Cutters, your Hexing Squelchers. Those are the two main things that this is for, but also Dragon's Rage Channeler, also Sneak Attack, also Burning Wish, also Amped Raptor, Flipped a Johnny. If your opponent flips their Ajani in combat, you can Hydroblast it before they can activate it. So keep in mind stuff like that. And then these cards here are really good in the mirror, but also can be brought in against other fair strategies. Some people like to main deck Barrowgoyf, but I do think it belongs in the sideboard. I think the main deck is just so tight and so streamlined. Some people are very successful with it, though. I often see challenge winning lists, showcase challenge, top 8 lists, all of this stuff, and people are running Barrowgoyf. If you love this card and you want to play it, be my guest. I honestly don't have overwhelming large-scale evidence to suggest that it couldn't be a main deck card. Just be wary that you might have to cut Murktides or cut Kaitos or Bowmasters, and these cards are all really nice. So handle that decision with care if you want to deviate from my list. And then Snuff Out is just really good. The meta is really fast right now. Even tempo decks just the first few turns of the game are so critical, and being able to cast a spell for free is pretty potent. Just remember, if you have Snuff Out, if you're playing the mirror and you want to snuff out a Tamiyo, how are you going to answer the Murktide that comes a little later? Just be aware of that. But you probably do need to answer the Tamiyo. Don't let your opponent snowball a Tamiyo because they won't need Murktide. So that's pretty much the list right there. Obviously, there are many different configurations for this deck. 2 weeks from now, I might have a slightly different list. Things are a little bit up in the air right now with Bilbo, but I hope that this serves as a general deck tech to understand all the uses of these different cards. But like I said, one of the most important ways to improve as a tempo gamer is to master your openings, which means assessing a 7-card hand and deciding how you want to play it. Let's look at some opening hands. Okay, so here is the first hand that MTGO decided to deal me. This is an obvious mulligan. There's no mana. Don't keep a hand with no mana. Not even against Oops All spells. Like, maybe if you had like 3 force blues and a surgical, you could keep against a deck like Oops All spells. So, must mulligan. All right, now this is a keep. And if I did have to mulligan this, I would probably just put back this basic island because already down a card, yes, Wasteland trades 1 for 1. And so when you're trading 1 for 1 down a card, that's not great. But I'm going to have to believe in some upside of some of these cards. And Wasteland definitely has a bunch of upside. So I would put that back. And then this hand plays itself. Just turn 1, fetch a basic, I would say, basic island and cast Ponder. Here is another hand that MTGO just decided to deal me. This is another obvious mulligan. 1 non-basic land is incredibly fragile, and there's nothing that it casts except Fatal Push. So this is an incredibly reactive hand and very likely one that will just get locked out of the game via a Wasteland. So I'm going to mulligan that as well. I will say one of the appeals of this deck is its ability to keep 7 cards a lot of times, but this is a nice counter example. All right, so this hand is actually a very interesting hand, so I'm glad that I was dealt this. On a mulligan, you have to keep this, but I would probably keep it on 7 as well. And Fatal Push is the most situational card. It might be amazing, it might be dead. And then the answer is how to play this. I would probably, if I was on the play, just go Underground Sea Nethergoyf. Yes, you could get Wastelanded out of the game, but you also might have the opportunity to daze it back to hand, and then you're just going to have to hope to hit with that Brainstorm. But if you go Polluted Delta and pass the turn, unless you're pretty confident that Daze or Fatal Push will be live, you're just slowing yourself down and setting yourself up to lose. All right, here's another hand that MTGO gave me, and they sure do like giving me terrible hands right now. Don't be tempted by this hand. Without blue mana, this is not very good. So I'm going to have to mulligan this. And you are at least seeing how sometimes this deck does just have really bad mana in the opener. And that is 95% of the reason to mulligan a hand. If you have lands and spells and you can play a game, you should keep it. But I'm going to mulligan this. And then just keep this, yeah. It stinks. It's not a very good hand, but I'm going to believe in this Wasteland. I'm going to believe in this Thoughtseize and Force. And I'm just going to put back the Sewers. And I'll probably start with, depending on if I'm on the play or the draw. If I was on the play, I would go Underground Sea, Thoughtseize. If I was on the draw, most likely I'm doing the same thing. But there's a chance I might start with Delta and then actually get this Undercity Sewers out of the deck. All right. Another opening hand. Where the only mana is Wasteland. This is like, someone should do the odds if you're watching this of all of these mulligans. I'm thankful I'm not actually playing right now, or as calm as you know me to be, I would start feeling pretty salty and tilted right here. So let's mulligan this. This hand is nice. This is the best hand I've seen yet. Just put back the basic island and keep the 2 duels. And the reason for that is if you keep a duel and a basic, you can get wastelanded off of black. If you keep 2 duels, you can't get wastelanded off of either black or blue unless they have double wasteland. And you can only play around so much. You can play around 1 wasteland, but don't play around double wasteland with your opening hand. So I would just put that back and keep. You could also argue putting back the Murktide because the Murktide has shown up way too early. There's a Nethergoyf, so there's tension here. And then you can afford to get wastelanded and still get this Bilbo down convincingly. So those are the factors to consider. All right, this hand is a nice keepable hand on 7. And then the question is how to play this out. You could play around removal and start with Nethergoyf with the plan of landing Tamiyo. You could also just start with Tamiyo and say, show me the removal. But remember, if you start with Tamiyo, you probably want to play Nethergoyf on the next turn anyway. And then your mana is wasted unless you actually wasteland. And then that fits nicely into the curve. But if that wasteland was going to end up being good, you could still go Nethergoyf turn 1, Tamiyo turn 2, and wasteland. So a younger me might just start with Tamiyo, but I actually in this hand quite like starting with Nethergoyf. And if they don't answer the Nethergoyf, maybe they're just dead a little bit sooner. Maybe they answer the Tamiyo, but this thing just keeps pushing damage. The only downside in this particular hand is Nethergoyf could be a 0-1 on your second turn, and that's awkward. So those are some tensions of this hand, but it's definitely a keep. Double threat, double wasteland, a flow state. Nice hand. Just for fun though, let's keep. Now let's imagine I'm on the play. I think MTGO will make me draw a card right away, but let's imagine that that's turn 2 that we draw that. So keep. Here's the draw. So it was a fetch land. So already then on this first turn, what you can do is go Underground Sea, Nethergoyf, and then let's say you don't want to wasteland on the next turn. Let's pretend that this Polluted Delta was just drawn. So I could, if nothing else, sorry, I clicked into combat. I don't have a stop in my main phase here. I would play the Tamiyo and then play Polluted Delta and just crack the Delta right away and get a Surveil right away. And yes, they know then I don't have Brainstorm, but it's pushing damage. And I think that's more important than bluffing the Brainstorm for the Tamiyo. Because oftentimes I think it's correct for an opponent to just go for it and remove Tamiyo and make you show them the Brainstorm. And so that's advice to you as someone who might play against Tamiyo. If you're always playing around the hidden Brainstorm in hand and you refuse to remove Tamiyo, you're probably getting got by an opponent who doesn't have it. And so don't respect Tamiyo and Brainstorm to that degree. Yes, you'll get burnt occasionally, but not a lot of times. All right, here's another interesting hand. This hand is definitely a keep as well, but you'll notice something is missing, some sort of threat or action. However, especially if you're on the play, this is a nice hand because Thoughtseize will hopefully rip your opponent's hands to shreds over the first 2 turns. If Thoughtseize is only needed 1 time, then you can Brainstorm on turn 2 and Surveil away the Thoughtseize or another card. But you do want to probably start with Thoughtseize for sure, but try to find action as quickly as possible with this Brainstorm. And once you have that, you should be good to go. But this is a definite keep. And this flow state is going to be switched on to get 2 cards pretty quickly. So even though this doesn't have a threat immediately, it does have lots of interaction. And this is where I think Dimir Tempo has an advantage over Izzet, for instance. If this was an Izzet hand of equivalent sort of cards, like, I don't know, a couple bolts and a flow state and brainstorms. Like, that's really not a great hand for them. But as a Dimir pilot, you can definitely get a lot of mileage out of this and probably have a good chance to win the game if you play well. All right, this hand is pretty nice as well. This is the most interactive hand and the most balanced hand so far. If Bilbo was a Tameo, I'd feel even better, but I think this is overall a pretty nice hand. You just have to go turn one Underground Sea Thoughtseize. But something to think about here is your opponent is a lot less likely to wasteland you if you cracked a fetch land to search for an Underground Sea. If you just play out Underground Sea and go Thoughtseize, they're much more likely to wasteland you because they might sense that that was the only land drop you had, or that you really don't have a lot of options with your mana. And so that's something you can think about in your openers. Here, we don't really have an option to do it any other way. But if you have that option, let's say you're a little flooded and you would love it if someone wastelanded you, and you have a fetch land and an Underground Sea, just start with the Underground Sea because that conveys mana struggle. And so a lot of times, how you convey what's going on your side of the table will have a lot of influence over your opponent if they're pretty heads up. And so if you can convey the incorrect thing, then you're doing great and can make your opponent misplay. And maybe now that they've wastelanded you, maybe now they can't get their Kaito into play like I was talking about earlier, or something else. They can't beat a Daze. So think about stuff like that. And then Bilbo, once it enters, will be able to attack and Thoughtseize again, so busted. Or if there's a big creature in the way, you could push it out of the way and have a couple cracks at that. So this is just a really nice hand overall. All right, here's another quite nice one. This is one where I would be pretty tempted to play off basics. And the tension in this hand is the fact that I would love to go turn to Bilbo, but I also then don't have a fetch land for Brainstorm. So if you feel like you need that Brainstorm, it could be worth it to simply Brainstorm on turn 2 and hold the Bilbo. It might be if you're on the draw with this hand that you already need to Fatal Push something. But what I'll say is this hand does quite a lot and is overall just a really nice hand. And you just have to figure out for yourself in the game, if there's an actual opponent, whether turn 2 Bilbo makes more sense or turn 2 Brainstorm. And maybe if you see something you want to Fatal Push, then it fits nicely to go Flooded Strand, crack it for Island, Brainstorm, play Bloodstained Mire, crack it for Swamp, and Fatal Push. So this hand has quite a lot of flexibility, and you just need to read the game well. All right, this hand is also quite excellent. This hand has the combo Tameo and Brainstorm. They remove Tameo, I have Bilbo. It's a blue deck, I have Bowmasters. This is the most aggressive hand of any hand that I've had so far. If I could trade one of these lands for a Daze, it would be just about perfect, or like a Fatal Push, some sort of interaction, even Force of Will. But if you're playing against a fair deck, good luck, have fun to your opponent. This is a very threatening hand, and the card advantage is real. This is just a really great hand. You could probably afford to start Underground Sea Tameo. If you do go for the Underground Sea, it would probably pay to fetch Polluted Delta, with just one thing in mind, which is if your opponent has Anointed Peacekeeper turn 1 is really the only way in which I think it would matter in a realistic game of Legacy in 2026. Because if you start with Verdant Catacombs and then your opponent puts in an Anointed Peacekeeper and you have 2 Polluted Deltas, and this is your hand, they're going to name Polluted Delta, and then you're pretty much locked out of the game if your Brainstorm doesn't deliver. So that subtle single thing to play around is probably worthwhile. All right, last hand here. This is a good one too. You may not end up getting 2 cards off of Flow State, but it'll be a card in the yard for Nethergoyf. You can clear the way for Nethergoyf with these Fatal Pushes. You can get a basic, play off basics. You have Wasteland. You can end up tapping the Wasteland for mana to flow state and push on the same turn. Quite a lot of flexibility. It's going to be pretty bad into an unfair deck. And if they remove the Nethergoyf, then you don't really have a lot of pressure. But it's certainly a nice keep. I'm going to say this is like in the top, you know, maybe like 40th percentile of hands. It's a weaker hand, perhaps, and it has more downside, I think, than upside, but it's a nice hand. I want to talk about one overall Magic fundamental bit of gameplay that I think will help you a lot in any game that you play, and certainly if you're playing Dimir Tempo, and that is to sequence your entire turn from the beginning, basically from your upkeep or from your draw step, if you don't know what you're drawing, and decide how you're going to play the entire turn. And if that means casting a cantrip, let's say you cast a Brainstorm, then you need to go through that same process of how you're going to play the whole pretty much next 2 to 3 turns as you are casting that. And you should think of every detail. You should think about what land you're going to play next, what you're going to fetch with that land if it's a fetch land. You should think about what you're pitching to a Force of Will. You should think about what permanent is going to turn on Revolt. And you need to determine what you're going to attack with, if you're going to attack. You need to be thinking about all of these things as you're resolving that brainstorm. But what I see from a lot of people is taking game actions while you're thinking. If you're taking game actions while you're thinking, you are wasting game actions and probably not doing things as optimally as possible. In addition, I see some people cast a Brainstorm, resolve a Brainstorm. They have priority again, and then they're still thinking about what to do next. You should have thought of that as you were resolving the Brainstorm, because you might realize that you put back a card you want now, and now if you fetch, it's gone, or you wanted it in your hand right away. So rather than thinking about what you're doing, finishing that thing, and then thinking about what comes next, do all the thinking in as small a window as possible, resolving a single spell that has decisions, or making the decision about your turn at the beginning of the turn, about every single step. Maybe you need to wasteland at the beginning of combat. Maybe you need to wasteland on end of combat. Think about all of these things before you start going through the motions. Yes, it's possible that you might brainstorm and be like, okay, I'm going to ponder after this. And then you ponder, and something with the cards you see in that ponder changes a decision from before. That's fine. But you should have decided to cast that ponder as you were resolving the brainstorm. And so understanding when you need to think is really important in Magic the Gathering. If you're thinking at the wrong times, you're probably not making the right plays. I want to finish the video by talking about a couple of paid resources that you have access to if you like Dimir Tempo. And I'm going to be honest, I have no intention of making a Dimir Tempo sideboard guide. And there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, I'm not particularly passionate about sideboard guides. I've made a few, and they get out of date really quickly. So it's a lot of work for not a lot of sustained usage. But if you're on your way to a big tournament, like if you want to go to Eternal Weekend and you're picking up Dimir Tempo a little late, then get a guide as close to the event as possible where you can still absorb all the information. Because if you get the guide too early, maybe Bilbo got printed, and now what is a Dimir Tempo guide worth? Maybe there's a lot of stuff about the Fantasticar, and now Fantasticar is banned. So just if you get a guide, understand that it doesn't last that long. And so another reason why I don't plan on making a Dimir Tempo guide is I think there's two really good players who already have such a thing who I would highly recommend. The first is this player, Ocean Soul 92. And Ocean Soul 92 has a Patreon that I'm on right here. You can become a member. And there's lots of good content about Dimir Tempo. I know Ocean Soul also plays like Pauper, other formats. But if you want a guide to the deck that is the closest to mine, I would highly recommend Ocean Soul 92 because we always play very similar lists. We have a little bit of a dialogue about it. And um, whenever I am wondering if something I'm doing sounds good, I really like to bounce ideas off of Ocean Soul 92 and just make sure I'm, on the right track. So I would definitely recommend this Patreon and the Dimir Tempo guide from Ocean Soul 92. Another really great resource is Eco Baronen's Metafy account. Eco Baronen is an exceptional player, exceptional content creator. I've learned a lot from his videos and definitely would recommend any guide that he's made. There's also a lot of guides from other players for other formats here. Like I, a year ago, got Larson's guide for Cephalid Breakfast off of this site. There are some definite differences between how I like to approach Dimir Tempo and how Eco Baronen does. But if you're looking for, let's say you want to play my list, but you're looking for really great information about the fundamentals of the deck, matchup notes, I think that this is also a really outstanding resource, and I would highly recommend both of these. And if you're really deep diving into Dimir Tempo, I would highly recommend those. I would be remiss if I did not also mention the YouTube channel Curdy MTG. Curdy is, if I had to imagine, probably the most passionate Dimir Tempo player I can think of, because all of this content is Dimir Tempo with lots of good results, 5-0s, challenge finals. Curdy's a good player. I don't think we've played too many times, maybe like once or twice. But I definitely really like this channel. There's great commentary, great gameplay, and I would definitely recommend if you enjoy the Dimir Tempo content that I produce, if you want even more of that, Curdy has got your back. So there's lots of good YouTube content from Eco Baronen, from me, from Curdy. If you're looking for content on this deck from people who can play it well. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into Dimir Tempo. It was fun to talk about a deck that I feel so passionately about and to explain a lot of things that if you just watch a random set of games, you might miss. Some of these interactions that I mentioned maybe never have come up. But there's lots of fun stuff, and I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to leave here with one really cool game state I want to show you. This was from a Twitter post I made a while back that of all my Twitter posts is like the most viral one I've ever done. And it's just a cool homage to how awesome this deck is. All right, so here is a screenshot that I shared on X a few months ago. And I am hiding the comments of it, but here is the gist of it. I have lethal this turn. Do you see the line? If you see it, you should comment it, and I'll tell you if you're right. It's a pretty cool one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.